Hi folks, how you doing today? Just thought I'd log in a couple of minutes early in case anybody has questions. We won't start. If you're watching the recorded version of this, you're probably going to want to skip ahead 3 minutes because it's 10:57 right now. I think I'm going to start doing that as a typical habit to give those of you who want to log in early a chance to ask questions. I know you can do that in a typical seated class, so let's see if that works well here. If anybody's logged in right now, if you want to type your questions in the chat bar, I'd be more than happy to answer them. If you want to send me a text on my Remind phone, I'd be more than happy to answer those live on air as well. Okay, I hope you folks had a chance to watch the Test of Awareness video. Did anybody have a chance to take a look at that? What'd you think? I'd be curious to hear what you thought of it. I thought it's kind of neat myself. Good morning, Ken. So tomorrow is the day that you're going to be missing because you're going to be at the parade. Woohoo! Oh yeah. All right, looking forward to that. Good morning, Needy. It's great to see you. Glad to see everybody coming back every morning. Miss the moonwalk. Right? Fantastic. So I noticed a couple of people did their homework a little bit early and already turned it in for this week. If you're going to do that, that's fine. Make sure you go through the PowerPoints and read some of this and read the books because I think there were a couple of questions that these people missed that they didn't necessarily have to miss. So if you're not going to wait for my lectures, make sure you go through the book and the PowerPoints very carefully. Hi, Maria. Pretty interesting, wasn't it, Maria? That's what we're going to talk about. Hi, Alex. How are you doing, Madison? Donnie Hahn. Fantastic. The gang is all here. So good to see you. All right, 10 watching now. Right, did all of you have a chance to check out the awareness video? I thought it was pretty neat myself. You know, that's they call that experience, if any of you, can I talk about it now? Open widget. Uh-oh, is this enough video maintains video as such viewer? Okay, are you folks having a little trouble with my signal this morning? I'm getting ooh. Yes, you are. I appear to have a signal problem. Streams. Good morning. Right. You know what? I'm going to move upstairs and see if I can find a better link. Okay, let's see. Are we getting any better? Signal still syncs. Okay. Good enough. But I'll tell you what. If any of you watch the video, poor. Why is it poor today? Hold on just a second. Let's see. Hold on, folks. Sorry. Hold on just a second. Let me go see if the boys are on the internet and chase them off.
Yeah, I was going to say, try resetting on your computer because it's working on my phone. Zachary? He's in his room. He's in his room? Yeah, he's there. I mean, I can go message the router if you want.
No, I can't stop the broadcast. It'll screw things up. You know what? I'm just going to teach from upstairs, I think. Is there any light on up there?
No.
No.
Good.
Crap.
You can cut the lights on though.
I wonder why my stream is so poor today. Let's see. Can you see me? Can you hear me now? See, I've still got a very poor stream status. Huh. Okay. I tell you what, if you folks could, I think what I'm going to do is shut my computer down and then boot it back up. Am I still jittery? Let me know, am I still jittery? Or is it any better? It's all right. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started then. Crap. Let's see. All right. Okay. So, I hope you had a chance to watch the video. Did you have a chance to watch the video? The awareness video. What did you folks notice about the awareness video? What was surprising? Or actually, Maria's already mentioned it. How many of you did not notice the moonwalking bear? Did a lot of you have that problem? Right? All right, so this week we're going to be talking about consciousness. All right, and consciousness can be described as just the things that you are focused on at any given moment. And we oftentimes talk a lot about the changes in consciousness. So let me go ahead and transition to the lecture here. Okay, so what you were noticing was a couple of demonstrations. You were looking at a demonstration of how consciousness is limited. What you experienced was called inattentional blindness. And occasionally, when people are focused on one aspect of their environment, they tend to miss really obvious things that come into their environment. And this is called inattentional blindness. Now, there's also this other concept that your book talks about called change blindness. And it turns out that a lot of times, if things change in the middle of your environment, people don't seem to notice those as well either. Okay, this lecture is not going well today, excuse me. All right, are you still getting me? Missed the bear completely. Right. Absolutely. You know, there's a really interesting video that I'd like for you to watch at your own leisure. Let me type it in the chat bar here. On right here. Take a chance to watch this. It's a video about change blindness. And basically they do this really neat experiment where they have a person walk up to a participant on the street and start asking them for directions. As they're asking them for directions, a couple of guys carrying a big board walks in between the two people, and they switch out the person. And the idea is, will the unsuspecting participant realize that the person has changed? And it turns out that about half the time, people don't know when another person is switched right during the middle of a conversation. And this demonstrates the concept of limited consciousness. Now, it turns out that we don't have the brain power to process every aspect of our environment. We we have to forget and not perceive lots of things in order to have the brain power and the attention to focus on the things that are important in our environment. So, can any of you tell me what color shirt I was wearing yesterday? Anybody pay attention to that? Probably not. I'll bet you didn't pay attention to that when you watched me yesterday. Why didn't you notice what color my shirt was? Probably because it's not that important. So the weird thing about consciousness is it's this state of awareness that you have that bounces around at any given time from one thing to another, sounds to smells to sights, and it's limited in that we're not able to process everything in our environment at the same time. Was it dark blue? Crap. Oh, I think you mentioned it. Crap, you got me. Okay. I can't even trick my own students, okay? But here's the idea. It turns out consciousness is actually one of the biggest mysteries in psychology. William James, if you remember him from a couple of weeks ago, the father of psychology, actually coined the term stream of consciousness. I don't know if you folks have ever heard that term. It used to be fairly common to refer to the ineffable nature of consciousness. The idea that consciousness was like a stream of water. And you can dip your cup in the same stream 2 different times in the same exact place, but you will never get the same exact amount of water, right? If you dip it in and get a cup of water and then pour it back in the river and try to dip in and get the same water, you'll never get the same water the second time. And William James suggested that consciousness was just like that. It was ever flowing and it was impossible to measure. Oh, yep. You're right, Travis. There you go. I'm going to talk about my shirt many times this semester. Exactly. And how does our consciousness decide what to pay attention to, Travis? It depends on it depends on what makes an emotional impact on us. And so when you're watching the basketball players, the emotional impact of what you're doing, you've been told to do a task and you're really, really focused on that task. And details not relevant to that task aren't processed by your brain's limited ability for consciousness. Now, where does consciousness come from? It turns out there's no one place in your brain where consciousness resides. And that's one of the difficulties of measuring it, because it seems to be everywhere and yet nowhere. And so your book introduces this thing called the global workspace model. And what it suggests is that your consciousness is a very fluid process that depends on many different parts of the brain. It depends on what's being activated at any given time. Now, if you remember yesterday, I talked about this thing called the thalamus. The thalamus is sort of the sensory waste station, and all of your senses go through the thalamus. And your thalamus decides what it is, in a sense, that may become conscious at any given time. And so you've got all of these different parts of your brain receiving input and wanting to pop into your consciousness. So your frontal lobe is thinking about plans and ideas that you may have and how you're interpreting a given situation. Your sensory cortex and your motor cortex may be feeling and moving your body parts if you've ever fidgeted in a talk and paid attention to how your shirt was itchy all of a sudden. Your parietal lobe kind of is aware of where you are in space. You're hearing things. You may be smelling things. Your occipital lobe is seeing different things, and your consciousness depends upon which part of your brain happens to be active at any given time. Cool experiment. If you look at the picture on the left side of the screen, you'll see that we have a picture of a house, we have a picture of a face, and then we have a combined picture of a house and face together. This is, I think, 1988 by a fellow named Tom. And what they did was they would have people look at the superimposed house and face while measuring their brain activity in an MRI. If you remember from yesterday's lecture, I suggested to you that there's a spot in your temporal lobe called the fusiform gyrus that is responsible for perceiving faces. When you see a face, that part of your brain lights up. Farther up in your temporal lobe, you have an area for recognizing objects, like cars, like baseballs, and like houses. And when you see a house, that part of your brain lights up. So what they do is they show the superimposed picture to people and they ask them to tell them what they see. And as you're looking at this picture, what do you see? To me, the face comes through more readily than the house. And they measured their brain activity, and what they found was people's report tended to mirror what part of their brain was active. If they saw the face, if that's what popped up into their consciousness, then the fusiform gyrus was more active. If they reported seeing the house instead, their temporal lobe and their object recognition center would pop up. So the weird thing is, your consciousness sort of depends upon what part of your brain's active. Now, there's no part in charge, and if you've ever had this experience, consciousness kind of bounces all over the place. You ever sat in a boring lecture before, like you might be sitting in right now, trying to wonder if this is interesting, or you suddenly start thinking about your laundry, or looking out the door, or paying attention to the person in front of you who maybe had a bath and used too much perfume or didn't have a bath, right? And so your brain is always bouncing around like that. So you can think of consciousness as being sort of this all over the place type of experience. Now, one interesting demonstration of the localization of consciousness has been shown in the process of conscious vision. That is, being aware of what it is you are actually looking at. Remember from yesterday, I suggested that you have a contralateral design. Your left hemisphere of your brain controls the right half of your body and feels the right half of your body and sees the right side of your visual field. The left hemisphere of your brain moves, the right hemisphere of your brain moves the left side of your body, feels the left side of your body, and sees the left side of your visual field. Now, if you look at the picture here on the right, you'll notice how the information from the left visual field goes over to the right side of the brain, and you'll see how the information from the right visual field goes over to the left side of the brain. Two things to note here. There's a spot right there where they cross over. You'll see the two blue lines and two red lines cross over so that each eye can send the proper half of the field to the proper half of the brain. That's called the optic chiasm. All right, and then you'll notice that right behind in these little yellow structures, your visual signal goes through this part of the thalamus called the lateral geniculate nucleus, the LGN. You don't need to know that though. But you'll see that it comes right through the thalamus, and then the blue half of your visual field shows up on the left half of your cerebral cortex and the left primary visual cortex and the other side. Right? Now, the way it turns out, though, that you don't experience a left side of your vision and a right side of your vision. You perceive this integrated conscious visual experience, this movie that you're watching. And that's because your corpus callosum allows the left and right half of the brains to communicate together. Now, it turns out that language, as I told you yesterday, is primarily located in the left side of your brain. The left side of your brain is the part of your brain that's active while you're talking. So if I tell you I have a hammer, the left side of my brain is going to be active. On the other hand, my right side of my brain is going to be better with spatial skills and nonverbal skills. So if I'm actually using a hammer, the right side of my brain is going to be more active, right? So the left half of your brain can talk, and the right half of your brain is really good with spatial orientation and facial expressions, so you can tell I'm mad, or I'm happy. Ooh, that's not happy. Or I'm scared. The right half of your brain does nonverbal stuff, and the left half of your brain does verbal stuff. Okay? Now, why do you tell me that, Chris? Well, here's why. Because it turns out that occasionally people who have really bad seizures have to have their corpus callosum sliced in half. And what this does is this prevents the seizures from getting really, really bad. So a seizure is a brainstorm of electrical activity, and it sweeps over your whole brain. And it turns out that some people who have really, really severe seizures, the only thing that helps is what's known as a commissurotomy. that is slicing their left half of their brain. They're slicing their brain in half right through the corpus callosum. Now, in the 60s, this fellow named Gazzaniga, who happens to be your textbook author, was a student working with these patients who were known as split brain patients. And he and his colleagues discovered some really weird things about these patients. All right? If you would tell them to fixate at a point in the middle of their field of vision, you could show them a picture on the right and the left, and that information would go to the correct hemisphere, but it couldn't communicate. And so what they would do is they would have a person look, and they might show them these two pictures. Now here, let me try to keep consistent with the example that they're using right here. Okay, so what they do is they do. All right. So what they do is they'd have the person look at this screen, and they might ask them to say what they had seen. And if you ask this person right here, looking at the dot in the middle, to tell you what they saw, they will be able to tell you that they saw a chicken leg. All right, do you see that? And that's because the information on the right half of the brain would go to the left half, which is verbal, right? And so that's not surprising. Now, if they ask the person to tell them what's on the left side of the screen, the person will say, I don't see anything. And that's because the information of the house is going to the right side of the brain, which is not verbal, and it can't tell what it's seeing. So the conscious experience is that you're seeing nothing. Now, if the doctor asks the person with their right hand to point at the appropriate tool for the object they can't see, the person will point to the snow shovel. So the right side of the brain knows what it's seeing, but it can't talk about it. And so in your conscious experience, if I asked you what you were seeing on the left side of your field, you would come to the conclusion that you weren't seeing anything. All right? And so this shows how your consciousness is kind of split in the left and the right half of your brain. If you can't talk about something, then in a sense, you're going to come to the conclusion that you don't actually see it. I don't know if that made any sense. There's a really good discussion of split brain patients, but they show how our conscious experience can be trapped in one side of our brain or another and lead to an impaired sense of conscious experience. All right, now we often talk about different levels of consciousness. We can talk about people who have no consciousness. You might say that these people who are in a coma, have no conscious activity, right? When you're asleep at night or you get knocked out, we might say you're unconscious, right? So you're at a very low functioning state of consciousness, right? And then we talk about conscious awareness, which is what we're experiencing right now. And then sometimes we can talk about altered states of consciousness. And that's when our consciousness takes a different quality that we don't normally experience. Do any of you meditate? If you do, go ahead and type into your thing. Let me know if you meditate. I'd be curious. By the way, how is the stream getting? Is it any better? Is the stream any better? And I apologize if it isn't. Okay? Now, let's think of altered states of consciousness. Let's think of meditation as one form of altered states of consciousness. And if any of you have ever meditated, what you do is you try to learn how to control the random bouncing around nature of your consciousness. So consciousness is very uncontrolled. Remember, I suggested to you in the global workspace model, it's all of these different parts of your brain. Now, no one of them is in charge. You don't have a spot in your brain that organizes all of these different sensory experiences. So consciousness kind of bounces around very randomly, if you will. And if you've ever sat around with nothing to do, you'll find that your mind is just uncontrollable with thoughts. Some of you probably, when you go to sleep at night and try to go to bed at night, you'll find that your mind bounces around uncontrollably. Meditation is an altered state of consciousness where you practice learning how to control your attention. Either you learn how to focus on one particular thing, all right, focused meditation. So you might focus on a mantra, or you might focus on your nose, or you might focus on the sound of a bell or a candle. And then there's transcendental meditation, which is where you let thoughts come in and leave. You let your mind flow with consciousness, but you don't try to stop and focus on any given thought. You just sort of let them flow through. And it turns out that the regular practice of meditation is associated with lots of good physical outcomes. It improves all of our health measures like our blood pressure, cholesterol level, glucose level. People usually see decreases in stress, negative emotions, and depression. Why does this happen? All right, well, it turns out, number one, a common misconception that used to exist in the old days about brains was the idea that brains have different levels of activity. So sometimes your brain is more active than other times. Did you know what? Your brain's glucose use doesn't vary more than 5% at any time during the day. When you're relaxed, your brain is at work. When you're taking a math test, your brain is at work. When you're playing football, your brain is at work. When you're sleeping, your brain is at work. It's never unactive, all right? So it's always moving around. And these researchers in the 50s and 60s began to discover that there were different areas of the brain that were systematically active when we're not doing anything in particular. So if you're sitting around being bored, your brain's default mode network begins to get active. And this is 3 spots in your brain that aren't typically active, but they are when you are just chilling out, not doing anything. And your default network, it tends to focus on memories. It tends to focus on memories about you, and it tends to focus on things that are fairly negative. I don't know if any of you sit around and think sometimes, but if you've ever been alone at your house in your thoughts, you notice we never really think about good things. We always think about kind of sad, depressing things. And people who ruminate and have a lot of depression, it's because they sit around and negative thoughts come up in their mind time after time after time. Well, that's because this default mode network, or sometimes it's called the task negative network, tends to be more active when we're not doing anything, and it tends to think about negative, depressing things. Well, it turns out that people who learn how to meditate, that is to control their mind when their mind is at rest, they tend to show less activity in the default mode network. And so they engage in less of this negative, emotion arousing things like how my friends don't like me, how people are talking about me, etc., etc. And so meditation may train our brain to control the part of our brain that engages in negative and depressing ruminations. Now, a second form of alternate consciousness is hypnosis. And hypnosis, you know what? Actually, the reason I got into psychology is because I went to summer camp in 8th grade and I took a psychology lab, and they hypnotized me. And I thought it was the coolest thing that ever happened, because my hands were closed and they were in a vise. And they told me, try to get your hands out of this vise. And I just literally couldn't do it because I felt this pressure wrapped around my hands. And when I woke up from hypnosis, I was like, dude, I've got to be in the science that teaches people how to become hypnotized, right? So hypnosis is a social interaction during which a person responding to suggestions experiences a temporary change in memory and perception. And so if you've ever seen a hypnotist work, they'll get a group of people and they start talking. You know, the prototypical thing is a watch. You're getting very, very, very sleepy. But you actually don't have to do that. Typically, if you start talking in a rhythmic tone, quietly, and your voice gets really relaxing, you can get people to focus on a sound or an image. You can actually put them into a state of hypnosis. And these people will experience temporary changes in memory, perception, and potentially behavior. The question is, people want to know, is it really real? When people are hypnotized, do they really go into an altered state of consciousness? Now, on one hand, some people say no. What you're experiencing during hypnosis is that you are just in a highly suggestive role-playing behavior. So somebody puts you in front of a hypnotist, says, hey, you're going to get hypnotized, and you unconsciously adopt the role that's given to you. Now, you're not in an altered state. What you're doing is you're just trying to play the proper role in a given situation. If you think about it right now, the role that you're playing is student, and the role that I'm playing is teacher. What they suggest is that you have a person playing the role of hypnotist, and some people unconsciously decide to adopt the role of being the hypnotized person. However, there is research to suggest that the brain does actually change when a person is hypnotized, right? So there is evidence to suggest, and oh my goodness, where is that really neat thing I wanted to tell you about hypnosis? So, oh yeah, this is the neat thing. When you hypnotize, they did these studies where they hypnotized people while they were looking at black and white images, and they then gave them the suggestion that they were looking at colored images. And it turns out that the brain activity in their color centers suddenly became active, suggesting that hypnotism is a real altered state of consciousness because their brain activity actually changed. Now, it turns out people use hypnosis for pain remedies. So some people go to hypnotists to try to relieve themselves of pain. And so hypnotic analgesia is actually a thing. And you know what? It has been shown to be effective in treating pain. And it turns out that when people are hypnotized, the emotional center related to pain shows a decrease in activity. So, when you get cut on your arm, your sensory cortex feels it, but that's not pain. Instead, your sensory cortex is tied with your amygdala, your emotional center, so that you get the emotional experience of pain. Oh my God, I'm crying because it hurts so bad. So not only is there a sensory component to pain, there's really what us humans feel is the emotional component of pain. And so there are people who suggest that hypnotism can actually cut off that particular emotional center so that the pain is still there, but it doesn't bother you as much, right? Now, people sometimes talk about post-hypnotic suggestions, so I can hypnotize you and tell you that when you wake up, you don't want a cigarette. From what I've read, the post-hypnotic suggestion effects are relatively modest. So some behavioral routines will persist after hypnosis, but it's not super duper strong. And you know what? The weird thing is not everyone can be hypnotized. It turns out people that don't want to be hypnotized or are afraid of being hypnotized, they can't be hypnotized. People who are very creative, people who are daydreamers, people who get really engrossed in things, those are the people who are easy to hypnotize. Okay, final state of altered consciousness, and this is my favorite state of consciousness. It's an experience called flow. Have any of you ever been in the zone, right? And you can be in the zone doing anything. Have anybody ever been in the zone doing art? Man, you're doing this painting and you just get lost for hours in it. Anybody ever been in a physical activity, a game or something, where you are totally in the zone and you are shooting, playing basketball and having the best game you've ever played? Or if you've ever been playing a video game and you've been so into that game that you just freaking lose track of time for several hours. If you've ever experienced those feelings, you are in an experience we call flow. And flow is a highly focused, altered state of consciousness when you sort of forget about yourself and you forget about time and everything drops away except for the task you're doing. Remember, I suggested to you that consciousness involves different areas of your brain being active and perceiving things for your conscious experience. Think about flow is when all of these different areas drop away and only one thing has your full and undivided attention. This is the experience of flow. And if you want to be good at stuff, if you really, really, really want to be productive, what you need to do is practice developing a feeling of flow, right? So some days I get in here and I can do instructional design, making PowerPoints and lessons, and I just get so into it that I lose track of time and I can go for hours, and the stuff I do is really, really good. Other days I'm a little distracted thinking about the clothes and the laundry and the food, and I don't really want to do this, and I'm not nearly as focused, right? And so this fellow named Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, I have trouble pronouncing his name, is a fellow who wrote a book on flow and is sort of the world-renowned expert on the quality of flow. And he suggests that people who are experiencing flow sort of have these 8 different qualities, man. They lose focus on everything else except the task. They get this complete concentration on the task. Man, they're getting this. If you've ever been in a flow situation, every time you make that mark on the canvas, you know if it's good or bad. If you're playing baseball or that video game, you can tell when you're doing something right and wrong. So you're getting this immediate feedback, right? You lose track of time. You lose track of yourself. And in fact, this is what athletes are taught to do. Lose your sense of self-awareness, because thinking about the self engages your resources and keeps you from focusing on the activity, right? People who are in a flow situation, if you talk to them, they are reporting that they are having the time of their life. And you know what? When you're in flow, when you're in the zone, things are almost easy, right? I remember I got in the flow playing golf. I'm a crappy golfer, but I got in the flow one day and I had like 7 pars in a row. Never happened before or since. But I was just hitting the golf ball and it was flying perfectly and landing on the green, and I was hitting putts. And just for about 45 minutes, golf seemed like wow. You know what? That's a good question, and I don't think they've ever looked at neurotransmitter increasing. I would imagine, wow, that's a great question. I would actually imagine it's probably more related to acetylcholine, the attention neurotransmitter. Although dopamine and acetylcholine would probably both be involved in the flow experience. Great question, KB. And you know what? Flow experiences occur when we are, being challenged. If you've ever done something that's super duper easy, you lose interest quickly. If something's super duper hard, you lose track. So it's when you have this perfect zone of difficulty, that you get in the flow experience. And people who are in flow just feel like they can do anything, right? And so flow is this really special state of altered consciousness. Let's call it getting in the zone. All right? Now, consciousness, it's this random thing that bounces all over our brain, and it's based on the parts of the brain that happen to be active at any given time. Since there is no master controlling all of these brain areas, your consciousness bounces around and probably feels rather uncontrollable to you. And that is, in fact, the way nature intended it, because you need to be looking around and always searching for new input in your environment so you don't get eaten by that bear or that saber-toothed tiger, right? It's based on this brain activity that's occurred at any given moment. Vision and split brain patients kind of show you, and actually the change blindness studies show you this weird sort of modular nature of the flow experience. If one part of you, if you're not focusing on something, that brain part's not active, you're not noticing something. With split brain patients, we can show that they may see something, but they can't bring it into conscious awareness if they can't talk about it. And so we see that vision and split brain patients provide these insights into how consciousness is modular. And then I want you to know that we can think about lots of different levels of consciousness, from coma, zero consciousness, to being asleep, unconsciousness, to being in what we might call our normal state of consciousness. And then I suggested to you that there are 3 different kinds of what we might call altered states of consciousness that you can think about. Meditation, which is where you learn to control your own consciousness. Hypnosis, where another person creates a situation where they can control your consciousness. And flow, being in the zone where your consciousness is so focused like a razor that you become a machine, right? Now, tomorrow we're going to talk about the altered state of consciousness known as sleep. We're going to talk about REM sleep, brain activity, and we're going to talk about sleep disorders. So I hope you join me tomorrow to talk about sleep disorders. Does anybody have any questions so far? And I know, Ken, you're going to miss tomorrow's lecture, so you won't be there to give me any really good questions. You'll have to just follow up with questions on the recording, right? All right, if you don't have any questions, I'm going to let you go. I look forward to seeing you folks tomorrow. Till then, take care.
Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please consult your directory and call again, or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording.